Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I am doing my yearly reading wrap-up. This was a great year for reading. I went through about 102-ish books. This was also the first year I didn't have a reading goal, so I didn't set a reading goal on Storygraph or anything, and just kind of went with it. And I was able to get through more bigger books that I normally wouldn't have tried. So to start off with, I wanted to talk about 10 series that I both started and finished this year. There's a couple series that didn't quite make it. One was the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. I started the first book in that series at the end of last year, and so this year I did finish that series. I read the other two main books, and then I read the short story collection. But the first book was last year, so that one doesn't count. The other one was the Expanse series. I read most of the books in the Expanse series this year. I just finished the last one a few weeks ago, but the first book in the series, I read that at the end of 2023, so that one doesn't count. And I still have the collection of short stories and novellas, Memories Legion, which I'm going to be reading next, and so that'll be sort of at the beginning of the next year, because I don't think I'll be able to read all of this in 2 days. The first one is just a duology, and that was the Earthsea duology by Octavia E. Butler. I read Parable of the Sower and then the sequel, Parable of the Talents, beginning of the year. This series is outstanding. It's dystopian, but it's the kind of dystopian that comes from being written by someone who really understands what's going on and where things are headed, because so much of this feels so plausible and it's terrifying. I also made the mistake of reading these books alongside a couple nonfiction books that were talking about sort of the rise of religious extremism in the United States and sort of super fundamentalist religious Christian groups and their influence over the government. And unfortunately, I shouldn't have read that at the same time as this, because this was a very bleak time of the year because the fiction and the nonfiction were working together way too well. So these are great books and I love them, but I am glad that I am done with the series. I will say, if you're worried about it sort of being really, really bleak, the second book, it does sort of look forward to a more optimistic future. And so the first book is quite bleak and dark, and the second book still gets into that, but the second book also does look forward to things getting better in the future, which is what Octavia Butler was so good at. She understood what was wrong about the present, and she said, let's fix this and move into a better future. So for as bleak and terrifying as the series is, if you keep with it, the second book does sort of restore your faith in humanity a little bit. The next series that I read was a trilogy, and that was the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy by Cixin Liu. And the first book is The Three-Body Problem, the second book is The Dark Forest, the third book is Death's End. And there is a fourth book, but it's written by someone else, and I haven't yet read that one. So I'm counting this as I started and finished the series within the year, because I read sort of the main trilogy, and I know he has authorized other authors to sort of continue the story. This is probably a cheat, but I read the 3 books by this author, and then sort of the spin-off book by another author, which I do want to read, and I think I do have the audiobook of that one. I will get to it eventually, and then I will have read all of the books in this universe, but I finished the trilogy written by the original author, so I think that counts. This was wonderful, one of the best books I've read this year. It's a bit of a slow burn, and it's very technical, and it has a sort of unusual way of writing that I think some people might bounce off of. There's sort of this sense that people are very distanced from one another, and it can kind of feel a little mechanical at times, but that it fits the story. And so there's a few things where it either feels silly or it doesn't really feel natural, but in the wide scheme of things, once you get to kind of the end of the third book, all of that makes sense, because this is sort of talking about how people relate to other people and how they solve problems and how they deal with existential threats. Overall, this was really excellent, and I really did enjoy the series, but you do have to kind of be aware that his writing style can take some getting used to. He reminds me a lot of Michael Crichton. Michael Crichton's writing is very technical, and a lot of his characters can feel a little mechanical at times. Michael Crichton has never been known for writing characters that have endured in the public consciousness for years and years and years, but his stories do, his concepts do. And aside from a character like Ian Malcolm, who owes a lot to kind of Jeff Goldblum's portrayal in the movie version, there aren't really many other characters in Michael Crichton's books that are sort of iconic pop culture figures, and I think this author does a similar kind of thing. What makes his books so good are the concepts and the way that he delves into what makes humanity tick and what makes people make decisions that they do, what makes governments do what they do. It's very macro, especially once you get to the third book in the series, because it's like that's where it sort of gets massive and huge in scope. So if you bounce off of this because you're not really connecting with the characters specifically, I would say, read something else. If you're not enjoying it, that's fine. But if you're interested in kind of the big concept sci-fi questions that he asks about human nature and the world, I would say stick with it, because ultimately the story isn't about sort of the individual people. It's about how the individual people make up sort of the collective will of the planet, and how kind of humanity as a whole works together. So I would still definitely recommend this one. The next series that I read this year was actually a reread, but I read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series by Douglas Adams. And it's funny because I read this years ago, and I remember really enjoying it. I thought it was really funny, and I wanted to kind of get back into it and reread it again kind of as an adult. And it's funny, my impression of the series had sort of changed a little bit. I still think the series is great, and the first book especially is a classic for a reason. Adams is such a good writer, and he's so good at satirizing the things that make humanity flawed in interesting ways. So I'm not going to say I don't recommend it, but I will say the books do tend to feel a little, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And there's so much happening in each book that when you look at like a plot summary, it's so long because there's so much stuff happening. And so it can feel a little overwhelming at times, and there is a lot of points, especially in like the third and fourth book, where I got completely lost and I kind of lost track of where everyone was and what everyone was doing because there was so much happening. So I do think the books do tend to get a little over the top, and the series sort of ends in a very like a darkly comic way, which is very British, so it's not surprising. If you've ever seen sort of the end of series 4 of Blackadder when he's in World War One, the final episode of that where it sort of ends with them sort of tragically going off to die, and it's like one of the funniest seasons of that show, but it ends on this kind of bleak sort of note that makes you think. Douglas Adams does that, and so I think the way the series ends can feel a little unsatisfying, but I still think overall the series is definitely worth reading. But I will say the first 2 books are very much my favorite. There's moments in later books that are just outstandingly funny, but I think the first 2 books sort of had the most coherent forward motion of the plot, and the characters sort of were doing what, you could keep track of everyone. I liked the whole series a little bit less, but I enjoyed the first 2 books just as much as I always did, if that makes sense. The next series that I went to this year, of course, in preparation for Wicked, I read all of the Wicked books, and then I read the Another Day trilogy, which is sort of a sequel series to the Wicked series, and that follows Elphaba's granddaughter and the adventures that she does. And I think overall, this was a really interesting reading experience. I really enjoyed doing my like in-depth spoilery recap of the first book, and I think I do want to continue with the rest of the series into next year, especially as we're waiting for part 2 of Wicked the movie. And so overall, I think the series works well, but I do think that Maguire tends to get a little meandery at times. The first book is a classic for a reason. It's excellent. It's thoughtful and insightful and digs into kind of the nitty-gritty of living under fascism and religious oppression and religious conflict and everything, and there's a lot to love about this one. The second one is very much a personal story about a character sort of coming to terms with his past and forging a future, and I did like it. I think the third book is probably the most meandery, but the final section of the third book is really important to the lore, so you can't really skip it. And the fourth book is ultimately really good, but you have to kind of slog through the first half that I think could have been shortened quite a bit. It needed some editing. And then the Another Day trilogy is good at first. The first book is good. The second book, I think the second half of the second book is really good. The first half does feel a little meandery. And the third book, while the third book ultimately ties everything together and answers some big questions, and I think it ends well, there's some stuff in the third book that I didn't really like of the Another Day series. The third book is The Witch of Maracour. But overall, I think the series is good, and I think at least the main book is worth reading. The first book is wonderful, and I think people can read the second book, although it is kind of different in terms of its focus, and it is a little bit slower. But overall, I think it could have been a trilogy. It did not have to be sort of 4 books. And then the Another Day series, it answers some questions, but I feel like those questions could have been answered in the main series, and I don't know if 3 extra books were really worth the, like what we got out of those. I mean, there's good stuff there, and we do learn some stuff about the characters, but I think ultimately, if I were to say, I would say stick to kind of the first 2 books. If you don't want to commit to the whole series, just read the first 2 books, or just read the first book, and I think you'd be fine. The next series that I read was The Phantom Saga by Jessica Mason. This is a trilogy of gothic romance books plus a novella that's sort of a historical fiction. And I loved this series so much. It's like I would say a dark romance, but it's a retelling of the Phantom of the Opera. But it sort of fixes all of the issues in the original. It still is dripping with all of the gothic ambiance and everything, but a lot of the character decisions are a little less simplistic, and Eric the Phantom is a lot more nuanced, and the relationship between him and Christine is a lot less terrifying. It feels more like an actual romance. It's very tempestuous, and there's a lot going on there, but it's really good, and I really enjoyed this one. It is quite spicy, so if that isn't your thing, I would say maybe read something else, but the character work is so good. It just feels like Phantom. It's one of the most perfect adaptations of the story that I've ever encountered. And the author is so much fun. You need to follow her on TikTok. She does deep dives into every single version of the Phantom of the Opera ever made. She did a thing for October called Fantober, where each day she talked about a different adaptation of the story. And she's so much fun. And she's writing another book in the series, but I don't think that's going to be out for a while, because her next book coming out is another historical fiction set in France during, I believe, the reign of Louis the Sun King. But I really enjoyed this series. There's a lot more nuance, and I think it was a very, very satisfying retelling of the story that I really enjoyed. And I do want to get them in physical form eventually. I got them as ebooks. They do have paperback editions, but I'm not going to be buying a ton of books. So, I have the ebooks, and I will read them, and eventually, maybe there'll be like a special edition or something, and I'll get those. So moving on. Now, next up, this is kind of a cheat because the series is ongoing and it's only had the first 2 books that have been released, but I read the first 2 Legendborn books by Tracy Deonn. I really enjoyed this one. I think the world building is really interesting, and I love the conflict in the story. It's not just a story of this is the magic group and I need to be a part of the magic group. There's always this kind of conflict between there's this group of people who have sort of colonized magic, and then there's the people who use it more naturally, but the people who have colonized it are the ones who have sort of more power and so have more influence as to what's going on. And so the main character constantly feels herself kind of torn between these 2 worlds, and it's really engaging. It is YA, so it's sort of a breezier read. I wouldn't say it's a simple read, but it is sort of focused more on action and sort of, you know, the emotional journey of the main character and kind of her internal struggle. And it's a lot of fun, and I'm really looking forward to the 3rd book in the series. Next up is another duology, and that was The Shining duology by Stephen King. I read The Shining and Dr. Sleep, and then I marathoned both movies, so that was a journey. And I love this series so much. I know Dr. Sleep sort of gets some flack from people because it's a little more optimistic than The Shining. The Shining is a very bleak, terrifying book, and it's so good. The second book feels more like urban fantasy rather than horror. There's still some horrifying things that happen, but it's not quite as relentless as the first book. But I think that worked because the second book is all about healing and recovery, and the way that it sort of takes the themes from the first book and moves them into the second book as the characters are older and they're processing things. It works really well because you've got like the nightmare in The Shining, and then you've got the recovery in Dr. Sleep. And overall, I really, really enjoyed these 2, and it was so great reading the books and then watching the movies, because the second movie, the movie version of Dr. Sleep, takes elements from the first book that weren't included in the first movie and is able to kind of reconcile the first book with the first movie and kind of tie it all together, which is really difficult to do. I still think the book was better, but there's some aspects of the movie of Dr. Sleep that are just outstanding, especially Rose the Hat. The way that she's portrayed in the movie is just perfect. But I really enjoyed those 2. I read those in fall, so it was a perfect kind of spooky season read, and I really enjoyed them. Next up was another one that I read in October, and that was the Indian Lake Trilogy by Stephen Graham Jones. And the first book is outstanding. I really, really loved the way that this was set up. And I think overall the series works really well because we do get sort of Jade's very complicated, long character arc. I do think the second book went a little overboard with kind of how much stuff it was trying to do. But also, a lot of times in like slashers, the second movie is always trying to outdo the first one. And so they always do kind of go a little overboard and get a little nuts. So I think that's probably what Jones was doing with that. And the third one, again, it tried to do a lot, but it tried to tie it back to the beginning. And I don't know how ultimately successful it is, because I think the third book, I don't know, I think all 3 of them should always have focused on Jade, because her journey is kind of the most important. And the second book sort of is a multi-POV book. And so by the time we get to the third one, where she sort of narrates the book herself, there was a bit of a disconnect there that I think could have been fixed if she had narrated the whole second book, or if at least we've gotten the second book from her perspective. And so ultimately, I think the trilogy is really interesting, and it does some very cool things. And I love the way that Stephen Graham Jones writes. He has a very kind of offbeat sort of writing style that just works really well. But I think overall, I really liked the first book in the series the most. And while I did enjoy the character arc in all 3 books, I think the first book has sort of the tightest construction. So if you just wanted to read one of them, you can just read the first book and have a great time. This book is wonderful, and I do want to read more of his work. I've read The Only Good Indians, and I really liked that one, and he's got a couple more out, so I definitely want to read more of his work. Next up, I read a fantasy YA trilogy, and that was the Immortals trilogy by Cheryl S. Mackey. This is a prequel series to her kind of YA fantasy romance, epic fantasy series. And this one it was fun. I really liked the characters. They have kind of a D&D group sort of vibe where each one has a different ability, they have a different weapon, they all have kind of complicated backstories, and the series is kind of about them kind of coming to terms with things in their past and defeating kind of a big enemy. Overall, while I enjoyed them as I was reading them, now that I've had time to reflect on it, overall I think the series suffers a little bit from being too inside everyone's heads, because sometimes it's a little difficult to follow what the actual action is, because there's long stretches of just one person's thoughts or a conversation or a flashback that explains something, and I don't know, I had a little bit of trouble kind of keeping everything straight. And I got to the end of the third book. I was expecting it to be a trilogy, and it does end on a cliffhanger. So there's probably going to be more books in the series coming. I'm not quite sure. Maybe there's going to be a sequel trilogy that will carry on the story. But I don't know if I'm going to rush to that one. Now, I did enjoy the first book of her main series that this is a prequel to. The first book is called The Unknown Sun, and it's sort of your standard portal fantasy, teenage girl from the modern day gets sent to a magical world and has to kind of uncover a mystery, and she teams up with people there, and there's a romance there, and it's fun and fluffy and optimistic, and the character arc for the main character is really good, and definitely something that I think young people would glom onto really easily, because a lot of the things that she struggles with are things that every teenager has really struggled with. So I really enjoyed that one, and I think I will continue that series. The second book of that one is now out, but I think the prequel series, once there's more books, I might go back to it, but I think overall I had trouble kind of connecting to the plot. The characters were wonderful, but I did have trouble connecting to the plot and sort of figuring out what happened, especially in the second book. I really lost track of sort of what was going on. The third book did kind of bring it all together in good ways, but overall I just spent the whole time a little more confused than I think I should have been. And then finally, I read the Stone Circle trilogy by Ophelia Wells Langley. The first book is The Borderlands Princess, the second one is The Stone Circle Queen. This is a fae romantasy duology, and overall, I think this was a ton of fun. The magic system is great. The main character is really good. She's someone you really, really want to root for. I do think it gets a little meandery in the middle of each book, just because I think there's a lot of world building that needs to be set up. And so while everything did ultimately come together, there was a few moments where I found myself getting a little impatient with kind of where things were going. Overall, I did enjoy it, and I think the character arcs were good, but I kind of just wanted it to be a little tighter, and I wanted a little more at the end, because the second book ends a little abruptly. It's like the main villain final confrontation happens, and then it just ends immediately right after that. And I kind of did want a little bit more, especially because the romance was a big part of it, and the characters spend a lot of time apart. So I really wanted to have more time of sort of them together and happy. It's romance, that's what you expect. But I think overall it was great, and I did enjoy this one more so than like the Immortals series. But those are the series that I started and finished this year. Next up, I wanted to talk about the top 10 standalone books that I read this year. There was quite a few, and I think all of them pretty much that I read were a ton of fun, and this was kind of a hard list to pare down. So this is, I was originally going to say 5, but I could not trim it down to 5. So this is my 10 favorite standalone books that I read this year. The first one on the list is The Foxwife by Yangtze Chu. This was such a unique book. It has the feel of magical realism. I know it's sort of categorized as more fantasy, historical fantasy, folklore fantasy, but the way it blends sort of the historical tumult of the time period with the folklore of sort of northern China and the beliefs of sort of what foxes can do and how foxes can turn into people and hide among people and how they act and everything. and you've got two storylines, one of which is sort of a murder mystery of sorts, and the other one is sort of a revenge story told from the point of view of a fox who's taken the form of a woman who's trying to find the person who killed her child. And then the other one is a man who's investigating the death of a kind of an unknown woman, and the two stories end up blending together, and there's all kinds of drama. I love the way the book frequently talks about sort of Chinese opera and the drama of it and everything, and by the end of the book it feels like you're watching a Chinese opera, because you've got sort of this big cast of characters and the mistaken identities and the retribution meted out to kind of the unjust people and the mistakes that people make that come back to get them. It was really, really a lot of fun. And the audiobook is narrated by the author, and she does a fantastic job. I think I do want to read this one again, but I want to read it in physical form now that I kind of know how everyone's names are pronounced. The Foxwife was wonderful and would definitely recommend that one. Next on the list is Jubilee by Margaret Walker. This is a historical fiction book, and it's kind of a companion book to Gone with the Wind. Not in that it's telling the same story, but it's set in the same time period, and it tells a similar kind of story, looking at sort of one woman's experiences through the kind of antebellum period, the Civil War, and then Reconstruction, and how she sort of survives. But it's from the point of view of a black family. It is so well done. It's very spare and elegant. It isn't like rushed or anything, or that things were missing, or it's not described well. It's very deliberate in how it focuses on dialect and speech and voice, and there's whole sections where it's literally just dialogue. There's no dialogue tags, there's no actions or anything, it's just dialogue, and you really come to know the voices of all the characters, and the story that it's telling is such a powerful human story, and it's heartbreaking at times and it's inspiring at others, and it has this massive, huge sweep, and it works really well. And I loved it so much and would definitely recommend more people read it, because I had not heard about it until recently. And this is a book that I think younger people should read in schools. It's definitely one that I think kids could read in high school and understand it and connect with it and get a lot out of it. There's other books that I think high school students are forced to read that are either a little too dry or that don't relate to them in a way that they can understand, and so it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I know some high schoolers are forced to read Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is a fantastic book. I loved it so much, but for the most part, a lot of the things the main character is going through is stuff that wouldn't be relevant to anyone until they've kind of gotten older. And so a lot of time the book sort of flies over kids' heads because it doesn't really connect with them. But in this one, we've got characters dealing with sort of unruly teenagers who don't want to, do what they are told, and a younger main character early on in the book who's trying to kind of figure out how she fits into the world and everything. And there's a lot in here that would kind of appeal to younger people. So if you're on a school board somewhere, you should tell your people, if you want to read about the Civil War or talk about Black history or anything, and I know there's some places that are trying to suppress that kind of conversation, but I would say Jubilee by Margaret Walker is a classic, and it needs to be more widely discussed and read because it's so good. It's also funny, it's entertaining, it's not just sort of endless bleakness. There's lots of traumatic things that happen, but it is ultimately kind of an optimistic story about survival and the future, and I really enjoyed it. Next on the list was Lucy Undying by Kiersten White. This was so much fun. I went into this book really not knowing what I was getting into. I was expecting sort of a Dracula retelling from Lucy's perspective, and I was expecting sort of gorgeous prose, maybe something like an Anne Rice type book. What I got was this sort of wry, darkly comic story that was about queerness and identity and relationships and figuring yourself out, and it also somehow encompassed like multi-level marketing scams and cult behavior, and it sounds outrageous, but it worked so well. It was funny. The characters are so good. There's a kind of a big cast of side characters that you just adore all of these people. And I had so much fun with this book, and I'm glad I read it. I'm going to go see Nosferatu on Monday. So while you're watching this, I'll probably be at the movies watching another kind of Dracula redux. But Lucy Undying was a ton of fun. It's definitely one that I want to reread in the future. And it surprised me in interesting ways. And it's something that in any other author's hands, I don't know if it would work. It probably would have come across as silly or ridiculous, but with this author, it genuinely worked well, and I really enjoyed it. Next up is another fantasy one, and that is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This one is a sort of folklore fantasy, historical fantasy. It's a retelling of the story of Rumpelstiltskin, kind of, but it's set in sort of a Eastern European country. It's like a fictional Eastern European country, and involves sort of these icy, wintry fae creatures and their relationship with people. And there's three kind of main characters who interact with these people in different ways. And this story was gorgeous. The winter atmosphere was just perfect. And I really enjoyed it. And I'm glad I gave this one a chance, because Naomi Novik's other big series that I think a lot of people talk about is the Scholomance series. And I gave that one 2 tries, and I just could not get into that one. There was something about the style, the way it was structured. A lot of it is sort of info dumps and backstory, and so the main plot, there's not a lot that actually happens, because you get to hear about why everything is the way it is and why it all works the way it does. And so I just bounced off of that. It wasn't really for me, but I'm glad I gave this book a try, because I really enjoyed it. I loved the vibes and the characters and the storyline, and it worked really, really well. If you have struggled with sort of other books written by this author, this is probably one that I'd say is one that I think you would connect with. So definitely give it a go. Next up was Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This book was outstanding. One of my favorite reads of the year. This is a retelling of David Copperfield, but it's set in kind of Appalachia in the 90s. And the way that everything is transposed over is really clever, but it's just a heartbreaking story. And if it hadn't have been a Charles Dickens retelling, I probably would have DNF'd it about halfway through, just because if this was a contemporary book, it probably wouldn't have ended well. It would have just gotten worse and worse and worse. And you needed that kind of Dickens schmaltz at the end, where everything sort of comes together and things are okay, because he always kind of, no matter how much he tortured his characters, he always ended his stories optimistically. And if I hadn't known that there was a happy ending coming in this, I would have just lost it and probably not read it. But it was just incredibly written. The main character's voice is so clear, and you just grow to just adore this main character. You want to see him succeed, you want to see him do well, and he just keeps dealing with awful people and awful systems that are kind of designed to keep him from succeeding ever. He just is sort of a victim of so much systemic failure in terms of how people in underprivileged areas are treated. And it's just, I loved this so much. This is the first book by this author that I've read, and I want to read more of her stuff, even though I've heard that it will all be traumatizing in different ways. But I don't care, because I adored this book. Next up this was a big one, and this took me a long time to get through, but it was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I recently got this edition because I had a gift card, and but when I first went through this, I went through it in audio, and I do want to read it again in physical, just because there's so many footnotes that I think in audio the footnotes get a little distracting at times. But this is a terrific book. It is a tome. It is huge, but I really enjoyed it. Susanna Clarke is such a master, and I know that, you know, she's probably not going to be writing a ton of books. I know she's focusing on her health and other things, and I totally respect that. But if we only got this book from her, this is like a masterpiece. This book is so incredible. It is a parallel history, historical fantasy that is set during kind of the Napoleonic Wars era and involves sort of two people who are trying to bring magic back to England. And there's sort of a long, complicated story involving the King of Fairy, or the Raven King, and the connection between magic and the real world and everything. And the writing style is so good because it starts off, it reads more like Jane Austen. It's sort of set in that time period. And then as it goes through the years, it kind of moves into something more akin to like George Eliot or even Charles Dickens near the end. And so it just feels like sort of one of these great English novels. I loved it so much. And I'm so glad that I have sort of a physical copy of it now so I can reread it and just get lost in this world again because it was so gorgeous. Next up on this list is James by Percival Everett. This is the first book by him that I've read, and I really enjoyed this one. It's a retelling of Huck Finn from the point of view of Jim, and it adds so much nuance to the story, but this book works on its own. This isn't a book that sort of, it has to be propped up by Huckleberry Finn. You can read this on its own and not know about the other book, and still it's a complete story. This book is just phenomenal, and the writing is so subtle and elegant. It almost feels too simple at times, and then he hits you over the head with some massive, observation about society or people and systemic prejudice, and you're just left reeling. But his prose is so deliberate and elegant, and I really enjoyed this one, and I do want to read more books by him. I loved this book. Next on this list is Grendel by John Gardner. Now, this is an older book, but I finally got around to reading it this year, and I loved it. This is a retelling of Beowulf from Grendel's perspective, and it's got this kind of wacky, satirical, comedic sort of vibe to it that just works so well. It's almost like Looney Tunes ridiculous at times, and other times he's waxing poetic about philosophy. And so it's not so much a fantasy Viking story. It's much more kind of like a meditation on how does one's consciousness manifest a personality, and how does one figure out how they relate to the world. And it's kind of told in this framework of Beowulf and Grendel and, Denmark in, ancient times. But it was so much fun to just get inside the head of a character who is lovable, but odd and sort of disconnected from the real world in interesting ways. But I loved this one. It was funny. It was insightful. It was gorgeously written. There's some really poetic moments in here that just blow your socks off. It is so well written, so well crafted, and it's a short read if you ever want to read this one. Would definitely recommend it. Next on the list is the other book by Susanna Clarke, and that is Pure and Easy. And this, unlike Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, is a very short, tightly written book. It's just an elegant, like, puzzle box of a story. And I don't even want to talk about the plot because it would give things away, but it's just sort of one character who's in this very strange place that just seems like an endless world that's comprised solely of sort of ancient Greek ruins and columns and rooms, and he's just trying to figure out how the world works. And it's one of the best books I've ever read. It is so good. Susanna Clarke is a treasure, and the fact that we have 2 books by her is just a gift. So Pure and Easy, I'm not going to say a lot about it, but read it. It is just gorgeous. If you like something like Lost, especially the first season of Lost, then this is something that you will connect with, because it's got that same kind of, we're here, we don't know what's going on, let's uncover the mystery of how everything works. Except you do get answers, unlike in Lost, where you have to wait till the end of the series before things start getting explained. But that's okay. Pure and Easy, incredible, a modern classic, definitely read it. And then finally in this list is The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. This is the first thing by her that I've read, and this book was a delight. This is fantasy, historical fantasy, kind of a parallel world. I don't really know how else to describe it other than it's just witchy vibes, and it's three sisters who are trying to reconnect with magic in a world that fears it, and the way that they connect with other people. But it's so emotional, and the relationships between the three characters are so good, and this is a book that will make you cry. And also there's just so much beautiful imagery that just pulls you in. It's just absolutely fantastic, and I loved this book. So those were standalone books. Next up, I wanted to talk about my 5 favorite nonfiction books that I read this year. The first book was The 1619 Project, which was edited by Nicole Hannah-Jones. This was really outstanding. It's a collection of essays, short fiction, poetry that sort of looks at the history of Black people in America and how they've been treated by people, how they've been portrayed in the media, how they've been used by people, the ins and outs of sort of systemic prejudice and systemic oppression, and how that's worked. And it gives a voice to a great many people who have sort of not been discussed or not been allowed to share their views. It was just a terrific read, and I would definitely recommend this one to anybody. Next up was a book that I read at the same time as reading Octavia Butler's Earthseed trilogy, and that was Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Demetz. And this book is sort of a history of sort of fundamentalist Christianity in the United States and how it grew to be so powerful in kind of the Republican Party, and the influence that religious figures have had in the US, and the fact that separation of church and state has always kind of been, it's not really true, but no one talks about that because it gives a lot of people in power a great deal of influence. And it talks about how this came to be, how it affected politics over the years. It was just an eye-opening read, and it was really terrific. I love the way that this person writes. I read another book of a similar topic called Fantasyland, and I didn't like that one as much because even though I agreed with what the author was saying, the way that he presents his ideas was a little kind of emotionally manipulative, and there is a few leaps of logic that he makes that didn't really feel were earned. And this book, I think, tackles that same subject really, really well, and it sort of presents it all very logically, and it doesn't go about it in a manipulative way that sort of uses like logical fallacies to appeal to people. Instead, it presents facts, and it's much more balanced in the way that it approaches it. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of when we're reading books, especially nonfiction books, that we agree with the position that the author's taking. You do still have to be skeptical about the method that they use. The same thing with documentaries. If it's a documentary about something and you do agree with what they're saying, but they're using sort of manipulative or fallacious means of getting their point across, then I would say maybe that's sort of not worth watching or not worth reading. And this book does a really good job of presenting the facts in a way that feels fair and balanced. And I'm sure there is some bias here and there, of course, but I think overall it presents the facts in sort of the best way that I've read so far. Another book that I read was Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism. The author is Amanda Monti, and this one was a ton of fun. It was a short, breezy read, but it was just sort of chilling in how it talks about how cultish language and cultish techniques sort of is able to pull people in and manipulate them and take advantage of them. And the author does draw a distinction between sort of actual harmful cults and things that are culty, but not necessarily as damaging. She talks about sort of like exercise cult behavior, you know, things like P90X and things that sort of draw people in but aren't necessarily harmful in the same way that things like multi-level marketing can be, where that really does hurt people and it really does destroy relationships. And so I really enjoyed this one. This was fun. It's a quick read. You can get through it fast, but it was very insightful in the way that it sort of addressed certain things. Another one that I read that I really enjoyed was The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalid. And this one is sort of a history of the Palestinian region and it looks at how the Palestinian people have been treated over the years and how the power of the Israeli government was used to disproportionately harm them. Even when there was no real conflict going on, it sort of talks about how the conflict sort of arose out of the oppression. And it also does talk about how there were actions taken by like Palestinian rebel groups that made things worse, and talks about how the conflict is much more complex than simply just this is a pure evil group and this is a purely virtuous group. It talks about how messy it all is. It does get into sort of the systemic oppression of the Palestinian people at the hands of the Israeli government, and gets into how that was implemented and carried out and the damage that caused. And I think overall this was a really insightful, wonderful read. I did read another book on the subject. I think it was just called Like Palestine, a 5,000 Year History. And that one was a little more unclear in its kind of aims. It was very obsessed with language and proving that sort of like the Palestinian people deserve to be seen as the only indigenous group there. And this one does take a more nuanced approach because there was always multiple ethnic groups in that area, and he talks about how at one point it was sort of more equal. It was sort of a mix of different people, but then once you get sort of governments involved, it's sort of one group of people is disproportionately lifted up while another group of people is sort of erased. And so I appreciated the sort of nuance that this author brings to the subject. It's a difficult read at times, but it's not torturous imagery for the sake of shock value. It never stoops to that. It does get into sort of the political reasons why everything is happening. And I really appreciated it. There's a ton of insight that I definitely got from his perspective of the subject. And then finally, for nonfiction, I read The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This was the first thing that I've read by this author, and I definitely want to read more of his work. It's a collection of essays, and they all kind of seem to be not connected to one another when you first go through it, but he is sort of painting a bigger picture about systemic racism and oppression and identity by looking at sort of different situations and different concepts. And he also sort of reevaluates his own opinions on things. The final essay on here is him talking about Gaza, and he talks about how his own perspectives on that situation changed and evolved over time, and how he learned more about the subject and how it caused him to sort of reevaluate things. It's a short read, but it's excellent. Would highly recommend it, and I now need to read everything else that he's ever written because his writing style is wonderful. And so moving on from there, I wanted to talk about sort of my New Year's resolutions. I wanted to kind of change things up a little bit. I know I've talked about sort of beating sort of the gamification of reading, and I've talked about how I've wanted to move away from sort of just reading for the sake of reading and read to enjoy things more. And so some of my New Year's resolutions are related to that. Some are more related to sort of stepping away from a consumerist mindset. And so my first resolution, which I've already kind of done, is I've unsubscribed from all of my reading subscriptions. So Audible, the Kobo audiobooks subscription, Kindle Unlimited, because a lot of these subscriptions were pulling me away from reading things I already had and sort of forcing me to always be reading new things. Kindle Unlimited too is also very insidious. If it's the only thing that you read, then you can definitely read it, and you can get your money's worth because it is cheaper if you read books through Kindle Unlimited rather than purchasing them. And the way that the business model of Amazon is set up, Kindle Unlimited is sort of, it works best when you're not reading a lot in it because it's a way to just take money from you for a subscription that you're not really using. But if you're reading books on Kindle Unlimited and you're reading enough, like say you read at least 5 books a month on Kindle Unlimited, then you're actually, like, Amazon is losing money on that because you're actually reading more than you would if you had just like bought them regularly. And Kindle Unlimited is a great place to find indie authors, and it's a place for many indie authors to make their living. So I'm not saying Kindle Unlimited is bad, but I was forcing myself to only ever read new books on Kindle Unlimited, and I wasn't reading anything else that was already in my library, because in my mind I was like, well, if I read enough books that are in the Kindle Unlimited library, then I'm justifying the monthly subscription cost. And so then there would be like Stuff Your Kindle events or sales where I would get books for free or for really, really cheap. And I wasn't ever reading them, because you have to keep reading a certain number of Kindle Unlimited books each month to justify the cost. And it was getting to the point where it was just, there was books that I was literally never going to read because it wasn't financially feasible to read books I already owned. Anyways, so I've stepped away from that, and so I've canceled all my subscriptions. I'm going to focus on things I already own. I'm not really going to be buying a lot of books this upcoming year. I want to focus on things that I already have. The exceptions, of course, are if a new book comes out in a series that I'm currently reading. But this concept of just, I'll buy the book as soon as it comes out, and then I'll get to it kind of whenever, leads to a lot of books just ending up on your shelf, and you're just reading them never, but you want to keep getting new books, and then there's going to be books that you're just never going to read ever, and you spent the money on them for no reason. And so I want to focus on things I already have, because I do have a backlog of books, and there's plenty of free sales online for ebooks that, you know, I don't really need to buy a lot of books. And I want to step away from that because it's a bad habit. I'm kind of a shopaholic anyway, and so it's just kind of a toxic behavior that I want to leave behind and focus on just reading what I have and not stressing myself out about justifying subscription costs. I also want to use Libby more often. A lot of times I would have books on hold on Libby that would become available, but I'd be in the middle of reading other books that I felt like I had to read first, and so I kept deferring books on Libby, and so I wasn't reading actually a lot of books on Libby. I would only sort of read them if the rare occasions where a hold would become available at the same time as I was finishing a book, so that I could for sure jump into that one. And so I want to use Libby more, because Libby is a wonderful resource. It supports libraries, it supports authors, and it's free, so why not? We need to support libraries anyways, because libraries are amazing, and there's a lot of people who think that they shouldn't get funding from the government, and we don't like that. So I'm going to be using Libby a lot more. Another one, and this is sort of a fun one, is I want to read all of Jane Austen's novels kind of in publication order, or at least in order of when they were written. I do have all of them, and I've read 3 of them. I've read Emma, Pride and Prejudice, and Sense and Sensibility, but I want to read sort of all of them and just sort of do a deep dive into sort of all of Jane Austen's writing, and just sort of lose myself in her world, because I love her writing, but I keep putting off reading her other books for some reason. And so making it a marathon sort of tricks my brain into being like, okay, we have to read these now, and I want to read all of them in the new year. And they're short, and there's lots of room for that, so I think I can definitely make that work. Next up is there's a number of authors that I have a bunch of their books, because whenever I go through used bookstores, I've picked them up, and I just have never got around to reading more of their work, and I really, really want to do that. So first off is Ursula K. Le Guin. I want to read more of her stuff. I've read her Earthsea books, and I loved them, and so I want to read her adult sci-fi. And I have The Left Hand of Darkness, and I do have The Dispossessed as well, and I want to read those in the new year. Also, Percival Everett. I loved James so much, and I was able to find Erasure, and I do also have Watershed by him. And so I want to read those because he's a great author, and I'd love to see how he tackles sort of contemporary settings. Louise Erdrich is another one that I loved Love Medicine so much, and I want to read more of her work. So I've got Night Watchman, I do have The Sentence, and The Roundhouse, and those are ones that I've picked up on used bookstores because I think I'll eventually get to them, and I keep reading other stuff instead of it. So this year I'm going to read the rest of her books that I have, because she's a terrific writer, and more people need to talk about her because she's great. Another one is Kim Stanley Robinson. I love his Mars trilogy so much, and I have a couple of his other books, especially The Ministry for the Future. My mother actually read this before me, and she really, really enjoyed it, so I need to get into this one because it's big and huge, and it seems like something that I would enjoy. But I also have The Years of Rice and Salt, which is an alternate history, which I want to read, and I also have one of his other sci-fi ones, Red Moon, and another one, 2132, I think it's called. And they're on my shelves, and I keep getting new books instead of reading the ones that I have. So Kim Stanley Robinson, I love him, and I want to read more of his work. And then finally, I want to read more Jennifer Saint. I loved Ariadne so much. She does myth retellings, and I've collected kind of all of her other books as I've seen them. This is the most recent one that I picked up, and Hera is one of my favorite kind of Greek mythology characters. I love her. And so I want to read more of Jennifer Saint because she's a terrific writer. I love the sort of dark, angry violence that she sort of digs into in all of her books. And I love the way she deals with morally questionable characters and gray characters, and she's a terrific writer, and for some reason I keep putting off reading her work. And I have all of her other books, so this year I definitely want to read more of her work. So with that said, that's everything that I have for you today. It's a new year tomorrow, no, 2 days from now when you'll be seeing this. And so you have a wonderful new year. I'd love to hear about what books you're excited to read in the new year, what books you loved to read in the previous year. Tell me all about it in the comments. I look forward to hearing from you. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.